Hey everyone, welcome to podcast number 4, The American Revolution. We'll be covering Lexington and Concord, Second Continental Congress, Declaration of Independence, Loyalists versus Rebels, strengths and weaknesses of the opposing sides, important battles, and finally the Treaty of Paris. So let's go ahead and get started. Where we last left off with the Intolerable Acts, it's very clear that the heart of the revolution, or the resistance I should say, is in Boston. Okay? The people of Massachusetts, especially Boston, are pretty much just all about getting rid of Great Britain. I mean, that is the beating heart of this rebel fervor there. We see the British get kind of concerned with this. They get concerned that the British are pretty much an open rebellion, or the Bostonians are pretty much an open rebellion. And so the British basically decide that it's time to, squash this before it starts. And so their plan is to march to Lexington and Concord and to, number one, get the rebels' weapons and munitions that they've been stockpiling. And number two, to go ahead and grab some of those rebel leaders who have been promoting this. Okay, so they march in the middle of the night. Paul Revere does his very famous midnight ride, and Paul Revere tries to alert that all these Minutemen that the British are coming. Okay, the first conflict comes in Lexington, which is a small little town. The colonial militia is waiting for the British. They're vastly outgunned, and they basically face off at one another. The British colonials are facing off against the British redcoats. Everyone's just standing there looking at each other, and then a shot gets fired. Now, we don't know who fires the first shot, but it indeed is that shot heard around the world. The result of that shot, though, is that the British basically just fire several volleys into the Patriot ranks, killing 8 of the Patriots. Okay, the Patriots then just run away. The British march on. They get to Concord, and by the time they get to Concord, word has gotten around that the British are marching. And so hundreds of these Minutemen, and these Minutemen are basically just like these basically just farmers with guns. These Minutemen basically swarm upon the British. Thousands of these Minutemen, are jumping out of the woods, shooting the British, and the British are forced to retreat. And the whole entire way along the way while they're retreating, they're basically getting shot at. Okay, and this is really the first conflict, the first violence that we see in the American Revolution. Okay, it's always important to note that when we talk about the American Revolution, it's important to note that not everyone is for independence. There very much was a good chunk of people that did not want to rebel against the British Crown, that wanted to stay as British subjects, being part of that British Empire. And these people that wanted to stay part of the British Empire, they're known as Loyalists or Tories. And they consist of about 33% of the population. And you can find a lot of Tories in states like New York, the Carolinas, and Georgia. In fact, George Washington himself, when he was actually in New York State or New York City, actually said that he felt like he was in enemy territory because there's so many Tories. And in fact, many of these Loyalists or Tories, whatever you want to call them, they actually took up arms against their Patriot brethren. The British Army employed thousands and thousands of Loyalist colonials in an effort to repress this war for independence. Now, the Patriots, they made up around 2/3 of the population. Many people have called it a soft 2/3, but a 2/3 nonetheless. The strongest areas of where you find most of the Patriots would be New England and Virginia. Okay, so it's important to note once again that this is not just a let's go get the British kind of thing. There's a lot of resistance to the revolution. It's always important to note the strengths and weaknesses of this war. The British clearly have the advantages. They're wealthier. They have a professional army. They have the largest navy in the world. They also have thousands of loyalists who are supporting them in those colonies. However, the weaknesses are that they have enemies everywhere. Okay, France is looking for some payback. Ireland was close to rebellion, and there's lots of other countries throughout Europe that just are looking for a chance to take a shot at the British. Okay, the other big problem with the British, and you can obviously read on your own, but the distance is huge. They have a huge supply line where they have to send their supplies over. Obviously, the Atlantic Ocean. Communication takes forever. It takes a couple months to get over, and then a couple months to get back, and so it's really difficult for the British to communicate and really implement a strategic war plan because the communication takes so long. And finally, there's really no American center at this point. There's no American capital. And so if you're the British Army, how do you crush this rebellion? It's not like there's a capital that once you conquer it, everything just falls apart. I mean, the British take over many of our urban centers in the war, but they have little impact. You know, the British take over Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, Charleston. Doesn't do anything. And so from the British point of view, how are they supposed to win this war? And the answer is they probably can't. Okay? American strengths, American weaknesses. The Americans are blessed with great leadership. You know, you got George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and even European recruits like Lafayette and von Steuben, who are critical in getting the American Continental Army up to snuff. Other big advantages for the Americans, they have to just survive. So long as the Americans have an army, they have a rebellion, okay, or a revolution. And Washington knows this. And if you look at Washington's overall strategy in the Revolutionary War, much of it is just keeping his army together, avoiding that conflict or avoiding that battle that could utterly destroy him. Okay, so for the Americans, they just need to survive. Some of the weaknesses, though, are also pretty important. Number one, there's no unity amongst the states. This is not one country trying to gain independence. It's 13 countries trying to get their independence. And while they work together, kind of, they very much feel like the sovereignty belongs with the states. Okay? And so, you know, a lot of these states don't get along, and they very rarely have a unified vision. Okay? Lack of supplies is a constant problem. Because of the policy of mercantilism, the American economy has been kind of stunted. They're pretty much a farming society, very little industry, very little ability to, you know, manufacture cannons or gunpowder or munitions. They almost have to rely completely on their European allies for that. And plus, you have the British Navy blockading most of our important ports. So it's very difficult for the Americans to supply themselves with what they need. In addition to that, there's very few Americans who have any military knowledge whatsoever. I mean, Washington himself was not trained to be a general. He was not trained to lead tens of thousands of troops in the battle at once. You know, so he was very limited in that capacity. Okay, so let's get started with the war. How it gets going here. So after Lexington and Concord, the British are chased back to Boston, and the Patriots lay siege on Boston. Okay. Eventually, the Patriots put big, heavy cannons on one of the hills right outside of Boston, meaning that they can now fire away at the British positions in the British Navy. The British, therefore, decide to basically sally forth, as they would call it, and boot the Patriots from Bunker Hill. They do so, but at a tremendous cost. You can see the casualties there. It's pretty significant. This battle shocks the world, both the British and the Americans. It shows the resolve on both sides. Okay? Now, while this is going on, the Second Continental Congress is called, okay, and they meet in Philadelphia, and they take some incredibly important actions. Number one, they adopt the militia that is surrounding Boston and create the Continental Army, okay? Number two, or part of that, I suppose, they named George Washington as the commanding general of that army, okay? Number two, they send the Olive Branch Petition. And this is significant only because it shows us that the colonists, even after Lexington, Concord, and even Bunker Hill, the people of America are not ready for independence. They're not ready to take that big leap and say, we're going to be independent. Okay? They send the Olive Branch Petition, which is basically a peace overture made to the British saying, hey, I know we've had some fighting going on here, but let's work it out. Let's not fight. Okay, that gets rejected by the king. Okay, and that brings upon the Declaration of Independence. Once it's clear that the British are not going to negotiate with us, that they turn back our olive branch, we basically decide that it's time to declare ourselves independent. And that's when the Committee of Five gets created. And some of the important members of the Committee of Five would be John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and of course Thomas Jefferson. They get together and write the Declaration of Independence, which lays out the philosophical reasoning for America declaring its independence. Okay, so I've already kind of talked about this, so I'm just going to move on. George Washington, we talked a little bit about him. As a general, he's great not because of his battlefield leadership, because he didn't really do that well. If you look at just some of these battles, you'll see he actually lost more battles than he won. What Washington was great at was keeping the army together and inspiring Americans to keep on fighting this very difficult war. The turning point of the war comes at Saratoga, which is in New York State. Essentially, the entire British army is captured by the Americans. So they lose 7,000 troops. Most importantly, though, it shows that the Americans have a chance of winning this war. Okay, and what that does is it gets the French to join our side. And quite frankly, without the French, America probably does not become independent, because the French are going to give us, soldiers, their navy, and lots of money and supplies to help us win this war. And so we need these allies. And one of the key turning points of this war, the key turning point of this war, is winning this great big battle to prove that we can do this. And once we do that, we get the recognition that we need. Okay, so American diplomacy is not to be understated. Okay, if we're all by ourselves, we don't win this war. It is getting the allies that makes the difference. People like Benjamin Franklin and John Adams going overseas and negotiating some of these financial treaties, these military treaties, these other European nations, really helps us out. Having France, Spain, Holland declaring war on the British, makes it harder for the British to, prosecute this war. It's also interesting to note that after we win Saratoga, even the British take us more seriously. In fact, they offer us home rule, meaning that we can basically run our own affairs, which is initially what we actually wanted. But we say, you know what? We've already come this far. We're going to keep on going. Oops. Sorry about that. The final chapter is Yorktown. At Yorktown, General Cornwallis, the British commander, basically gets himself trapped on this peninsula. And General Washington and a French general and a French fleet basically all at once trap Cornwallis on this peninsula. He's bombarded for several days and eventually has to surrender. When he does that, the British basically say, you know what, this is enough, and they agree to negotiate a peace treaty with us that is known as the Treaty of Paris, which is one of the most important treaties in our nation's history. Okay, it does a couple things. Number one, it recognizes American independence. Number two, it grants the United States generous boundaries. Sorry, the light just went off there. These boundaries go all the way to the Mississippi, and so the United States, with just the flick of a pen, becomes one of the largest nations in the world. And all this land will obviously allow America to grow in power and strength and become incredibly important to the world. The Americans also promised to restore property to loyalists and also pay back debts owed to British debtors, which we will not do too much of. So, anyways, that's all I have for you for today. Please feel free to follow me on Twitter. My website's right there. Email me with any questions, or follow me on YouTube. So anyways, guys, hopefully this helped.